Hey there, art nerds. Today I have a two-part comparative review for you guys. Today we are taking a look at not one, but two different Giorgione student grade watercolor palettes, and both of them are super duper cheap. We're taking a look at the, let me give you guys a sneak peek, because I will unwrap it on the during the unbox and swatch, but let me give you guys a sneak peek. So we're taking a look at this beautiful thing that cost me a whopping $10.99 on Amazon, and then we're taking a look at this slightly better palette, which was $14.99 on Amazon. So I'm going to compare these two. I'll let you know which one is more worth your money, and I'm also going to compare them to some other student grade watercolor palettes that I think are comparable to these two sets. So sit back, relax, and enjoy another unbox and swatch. Hey there, art nerds. I've got another entry for our student grade showdown. Today we're taking a look at the Giorgione 48-piece watercolor set. So let's go ahead, unbox, and swatch this watercolor palette. This is one of the cheaper palettes that we're going to be reviewing in our showdown. I paid about $10.99 for it on Amazon using funds from my amazing patrons on Patreon. Thank you guys so much. And this brand is named after an Italian high Renaissance paper painter. I first saw these on AliExpress, and it seems like they might be a white label company. They sell a lot of sort of basic art supplies like watercolor brushes, water brushes, paper, oil, paints. I regularly buy great Chinese art supplies on AliExpress, so I'm under no delusion that all art supplies from Ali are bad or low quality. But while researching for this review and trying to avoid other artists' reviews just to not bias my own, I couldn't help but see other artists' complaints about the paint quality. So I figure we're in for a fun ride. Now on Amazon, these are sold under a few different names. Get Artified is one of them. You can also find them on Banggood. I'm gonna have links not quite down in the description, so what I usually do is I type out all my show notes and include all my links, and then YouTube is like, hey, we've got a 5,000 word limit, or I'm sorry, 5,000 character limit. That won't fit. So generally what I like to do is I link the everything document in the description below. So you'll find a Google Doc link there. That'll take you to the full show notes that are gonna have all of the links for all of the things. There is also a Giorgione painting store on AliExpress, and they showcase some of the different kinds of watercolors that Giorgione has to offer. I mean, they're all very different. You have pans, you have cakes, but they're all just flavors of probably very cheap. I'm really getting the vibe that Giorgione focuses on budget student grade watercolors. If you look at their watercolor section, you'll see a lot of familiar faces. I kind of wonder if Giorgione is white labeling from other brands or if the other brands are white labeling from Giorgione. I'm seeing palettes frequently sold by Mia, like that unusual double wheel palette that looks like it'd be awful, but I'm so tempted to review it. Palettes from Art, the folding Schpirerr pan palette, etc. Some of these aren't so bad, the folding palette for example, and some are terrible, but if Giorgione is white labeling from other brands, it's going to make it hard to give an assessment of the brand's general quality, since it's going to be all over the place. In cases of white labeling, I usually recommend you try, if you can and if you're able, to just buy it from the original source. It also helps us cut down on repetitive reviews where I'm kind of reviewing the same exact thing white labeled by several different companies. That's what I've started to see when it comes to alcohol markers, and it's why you guys don't see me do a lot of alcohol marker reviews anymore. And it's really challenging for me to find information about many of the brands commonly sold on AliExpress because many of them don't have English websites, or the websites that do come up, or rather, the websites don't even come up when I Google them. It often takes a lot of digging, but I enjoy finding out about different brands and sharing what I find with you guys. So if you guys happen to have any information about Giorgione, if they have a parent company, if they are indeed white labeling products, or if they are providing those services to other companies, I'd really appreciate it if you reached out and let me know what the scuttlebutt is. I mentioned a couple minutes ago that this is probably one of the cheapest palettes I'm going to review during the student grade showdown. You guys are probably wondering why I would knowingly select some really cheap, possibly poor quality watercolors to review for you guys. So when I'm shopping for things to review, I used to look for both good things and hilariously bad things, but I got burnt out reviewing intentionally bad art supplies. So now I try to find the best, or at least the most interesting, either in terms of value or quality or both. But often you don't know until you try it yourself, and every artist has different needs and tastes. So this is also why I separate the unbox and swatch review, which has a more general appeal. It may answer questions about different types. I may answer questions that different types of watercolor artists might have when they're purchasing the product. This is why I separate that from the field test, which is aimed more at people who have already purchased the product and they might want to learn some techniques for using it, or illustrators and artists who have an art style that's kind of similar to my own cartoony art style. Which, before we get too much further in here today, hi, welcome, I'm Becca. I'm a watercolor comic artist. I make the comic 7-inch Kara. You can read it as a webcomic at 7inchkara.com. If you're a fan of the dead tree format, I have books available as well. And when I'm reviewing art supplies, particularly watercolors, it is with the eye of a watercolor comic artist. It's with the eye of, would I use this to paint 7-inch Kara? And there have been a lot of great professional grade watercolors that I said, you know what? Yeah, I would. And I add them to my daily driver palette. And when it comes to student grade watercolors, I am also an art teacher. I teach comics and watercolor. And people are always asking me if I can recommend affordable watercolors that aren't going to break the bank, either for themselves or to give as a gift. So that's one of the reasons I've been reviewing so many student grade watercolors. But you know what I've found while doing this student grade showdown? There's some legitimately good student grade watercolors that might be useful for artists who need a big palette of already mixed colors, who may be convention artists, people who do commissions, people who are generating a lot of sketches, people who are doing color comps. So you might not need professional quality for all of those instances, but you do want decent quality. You want them to be able to stand up to the test of time, and you want a lot of colors. So there is really valid reason for reviewing student grade watercolors. Now, that said, I definitely have some misgivings about student grade watercolors. Some are way worse than others. And while I don't have the highest hopes today, I'm really hoping I'm not going to get totally burned. So enough stalling. Let's go ahead, unbox and swatch these Giorgione watercolors. So these came to me from Amazon in this very stylish plastic bag. It could be reusable, it even has a hole in there so you don't suffocate yourself. On the back of the bag it says 48 colors watercolor patch and storage pouch new, made in China. It also came in some bubble wrap and a plastic bag, so that's a lot of packaging, considering they also came in a cardboard box that I'm not showing you guys. So on Amazon, these seem to be extruded watercolors, and those tend to be a miss rather than a hit, but at the price point, I do want to give it a shot. They also claim to be professional and high quality, and they claim to use the purest color pigments while being non-toxic, safe, and tasteless. It does come in a fairly cute metal box, so can't fault them for that. And there is Chinese and English on the box, so including 48 colors, watercolor cakes, 1 nylon brush pin, 1 water brush, and 1 drawing pencil, 80 sheets of 100% pure cotton professional watercolor paper. Watercolor cakes are made of color pigments, which make the colors get more colorful and better effects. Usage: using wet brush tip paints on the watercolor cakes, then it is easy to paint on the paper. Tin box package is better to protect the cakes. Small and light, easy to carry. It is a perfect choice for professional artists and students. So we will see about that. I'm really curious about that 100% cotton rag paper because we have reviewed a few other sets that come with paper, and typically I really don't like the papers they've included. So let us see if Giorgione gets to be the exception. I do know they make their own watercolor papers, so that could be, it could be, we could see. Y'all, somehow I have ended up in the worst timeline. These are the cheapest of the not Crayola style glycerin cake. So these are like chalk. These are like Halloween Smarties. And I did this to myself, and only I can blame myself. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to actually order one of the nicer sets so that we can compare the two. So for y'all, it'll be instantaneous, but for me, it's going to be a week. See you guys in a week. So friends, it is now about a week later. We have not one, but two Giorgione watercolor sets, and this is gonna allow us to do a head-to-head comparison. So both of these were purchased on Amazon. The pink one here was $10.99. This new blue one was a whopping $14.99. And I want to read the information that Amazon had for you for this set. So I'm hoping today that we can do a comparative unbox and swatch where we can actually compare the qualities of these two sets and see if this set is truly worth the $3 price hike. So this is a 48 watercolor paint set. They promise premium, which for $14.99, I don't think it's going to be premium, but hopefully it's passable. It also comes with 2 extra brush for coloring, a pencil for sketching and mixing, a pencil for sketching and mixing palette for painting beginner to enjoy the art creation. So technically both of these are watercolor sets. They promise richness of color. The watercolor paint comes with light yellow. Oh, this is cute. So if you dig on Amazon, you can find all the colors in here, but at the top, they give you like half the colors, and then they say, and more colors to find out. It's like, just if you're already gonna list more than 4, just give us all of them. The creamy 48 assorted watercolor cube kit for both professionals and beginners. Suitable for anyone who loves painting and wants to practice watercolor painting and drawing. With the highly pigmented paints, your inspiration will be easier to displayed on everywhere and performed well. It brings your inspiration into reality. High pigment quality make the vivid colors. High pigment quality mixes well, and there's no chalky or grainy feel to them after they are dry. With the highly pigmented watercolor paint, your inspiration will be easier to displayed on the paper and perform better. Come to your idea. Oh, it's so challenging to read. Now, it also says that we should be able to do many watercolor techniques, which is honestly really important because that Mia palette showed me that not all student grade watercolors are up to wet into wet techniques. So supposedly we can do watercolor dry washes, watercolor wet washes, wet into wet watercolor painting, watercolor underpainting, so like grise, gradients and color blending, layering watercolors, dry brush, watercolor blooms, feathering, and adding texture with salt. And today, we're going to be testing several of those techniques out, including dry washes, and wet into wet watercolor painting. So inside this cardboard box, you get 48 mini watercolor cakes. I think these are the I made sure not to get cakes. I went and got half pans on purpose because I think they're going to perform better than the cakes. 1 water brushes, 1 brush, 2 sponges, 1 cleaning cloth, 1 8-sheet watercolor paper, and 1 mixing palette. So unlike this kit, which actually, why don't we just unbox them both and see what's inside? So I will say that the extra $3 does lead to some more professional packaging. This definitely looks more like it would be a professional watercolor set. Whereas this one here, well, very cute in matte pink. Doesn't look not quite as nice. So inside both sets, we have our watercolor paper. This is made with wood pulp. And this, it's kind of hard to tell. I might have to get Google Translate involved to tell me what kind of paper this is. We also have here a timeline of the history. Might have to translate that. And then inside this, as you guys can see, we have some watercolors. We also have our water brush, our brush, what looks to be a tube of white gouache, a pencil, and our chalks in a very flimsy plastic tray. Whereas, let's move that over to the side. In this set, I'm going to show you guys what surprised me first. So, my experience with this is a tech glove. Like if you use a drawing tablet like a Surface Pro or a Cintiq, anything that has touch sensitivity, you wear one of these gloves so it doesn't interfere, your hand doesn't interfere with the screen. And you can actually turn that setting off on some computers, like on the Surface, you can turn that setting off. Anyway, I used to wear these a lot. I know the cotton ones are used sometimes by watercolor artists to prevent smearing. I just use a sheet of copy paper and I haven't had any real problems with it. So also we have our master watercolor, which I'm gonna have to translate. We have a watercolor color card which lists the colors in the set, so that's good to have, but it doesn't seem to list the pigment information or the light fast information. And then we actually have some information about the paints themselves. So it does seem like this particular set, they were trying a little bit harder. And then this, okay, this says 48, so maybe everything here to there is in the 48 set. I don't know, kind of hard to understand, but we will figure it out. We also have what looks to be a tech cleaning cloth with Giorgione screened on it. And then we also have this, it's like a pleather placemat that's been miscut on two of the sides. I don't really know, but finally, we have our Giorgione metal palette. It comes with the pencil. It is a Giorgione 2B pencil. It is also plastic wrapped. And then inside this, we have our solid watercolor cakes. Removable watercolor cakes, which can be reordered according to your painting habits. Watercolor cakes can be purchased individually when you use them out. So they are also in a very inexpensive plastic tray, but these are nicer. So far as we can see, they're nicer than these. They're nicer cakes. You also get a brush, a water brush, and a small sponge. There's quite a bit more in this Giorgione set, the $14.99 set, as compared to this Giorgione set, the $10.99 set. I think originally I thought I was getting this, but that's okay because now we can actually compare the two. These look terrible, and that's kind of fitting with the reviews for these. So I don't really have high hopes, but I have not reviewed anything this awful in a long time. It looks like Halloween candy. It's got a gritty chiclet kind of texture to it. So that's going to be exciting, but it definitely gives us a really cool basis for comparison. Having not even swatched them yet, though, I would say that this Giorgione set is certainly worth the additional $3 you pay. Everything seems a little bit more nicely made, a little bit more nicely presented. If you were giving this as a gift, this seems like it's a more professional palette than this. This definitely has those student grade vibes. This seems, it has the look, you know? So that of course is not the end all be all to what makes a watercolor palette worthwhile, but I know a lot of people are considering these because Christmas is coming up and you would like to give the gift of art, which I want to commend you for. That's fantastic. And just looking at these, I would say this one I would be more excited to receive. Kid me, teen me would be a lot more excited to receive this than this palette here. Unfortunately for me, I cannot speak or read any form of Chinese. I'm pretty limited to a smidgen of French and English. Fortunately, though, I can use Google Translate. It was up on the screen. And we can allow Google Translate to help us out with these translation woes. So I'm going to start with the cheaper set since there's less to translate, and then we'll move on to the more expensive set. We're starting with this sheet here, and the English says, Introduction of Giorgione Kunan Bran Nanqing Xing, and I apologize for my pronunciation, Zip or Yip Sean Painting Materials is a painting material company integrating production and sales. The Yip Nin Sean brand is sold in Spain, Italy, Poland, and other EU countries with professional and innovative concepts and has more than 1,000 local distributors. Reach a cooperative relationship. In 2017, Nanchang Yipjin Zhan BE Painting Materials Co. Limited turned its attention back to the domestic market and launched the Giorgione series of solid watercolors to train domestic painting enthusiasts with better quality. High management standards provide domestic painting enthusiasts with painting materials that are more suitable for the public. So far, it has been loved and sought after by the domestic public. The 1983, the factory was established in 1997 to make the top 10 excellent male factories in the domestic painting material industry. 1971, 1986, 2004, 2017, 2018. So I guess it's reading these as separate things. So the timeline's going to be out of order. We actually do get some interesting information here that will allow us to learn more about the Giorgione brand. So that was most of the printed material with the cheaper set. Now to try translating some of the more expensive set stuff, starting with the watercolor postcards that they've included. So on the postcards, it says the top 10 2017 won the first domestically famous holder. 2018 brands such as J-Works established global push Giorgione watercolor postcards. Master watercolor postcard Urbori 966T 3URS watercolor postcard MICCU full wood pulp. Coarse fine lines, 8 sheets of neutral acid-free median 10.5 by 15 centimeters, 300 GSM, 6 sheets gift, not for sale. I thought they said they included, well, duh, some of this is actually, I could actually read that. But the wood pulp part, I would not have known if it had not been for my friend, Google Translate. And then we have the watercolor pamphlet. And because I am a nerd, ooh, this is actually in English. So I would assume this and this are the same text. So that saves me some effort. So I will translate, I don't think I need to translate the front, but I will translate this right here since it seems to be talking about what these paints are made from. So this is what Google Translate has translated this. 210ONE Giorgio, the texture and white effects add to the work rope and jump. Throughout the Middle Ages, watercolor materials were used to draw parchment manuscript illustrations, illumination. The transparency is high. When the colors overlap, the colors below will pass through. The color is not as vivid as color ink, but the color is darker, suitable for people who like quaint colors. Even if it is stored for a long time, it is not easy to change color. The characteristics of watercolor materials lead to the peculiarities of watercolor art. The combination of watercolor, transparency, randomness, and texture are all topics worthy of study. The dry and wet density changes of the watercolor and the penetrating effect on the paper make the watercolor painting have a strong expressive force and form a wonderful variation relationship, resulting in a transparent and smooth, dripping and fresh visual effect of fantasy and good fortune, and it is controlled by nature. The harmonious and dynamic beauty constitutes the personality characteristics of watercolor painting and produces unique and irreplaceable special and yellow, amarillo, work, po, and ELO, and watercolor. The technique, I think it got some of this in there too, even though I didn't see it get it. The technique of diluting the color material with gum arabic can refer to its work and use. The pigment used in this method, in addition to gum as a binder, Yongxai pigment also includes plasticizer, such as honey water, which would be sugar water, glycerin, etc., to keep it alive, wetting agent, stable touch, phenol, and other antiseptic preservative. Watercolors are generally drawn with brushes on handmade watercolor paper, and the best brushes are made with red sable. See brush, red sable. Watercolors are bright, and gouache is a kind of opaque watercolor. Real watercolor is often free, easy, and wide brush strokes are done under the thin coating method. Was 7 He's. The grain of the paper itself, ONJC BC Curio. Whoo, that's the rest of that, I think, picked up some of this. So anyway, we did learn some interesting things like Yongzhai pigment, which is something I'm going to have to look up, in addition to the Nanchang Yipin Shan. Thank you. Just breaking it into syllables helped me out so much. Brush Material Co. Limited. But still have a little bit more to read. Fortunately, they've already translated this for us, so that makes my life a lot easier. Water as the medium to paint the paint. Watercolor pigment particles delicate, so weak, cannot be modified. When the painting is more water, is a layer of cover color from shallow to deep, from wet to dry. Usually repeat 2 to 5 times color. Clear watercolor effect, strong sense of hierarchy and strong performance. But we should notice that the color is still soluble in water after drying. The water content of solid watercolor is relatively low, showing a state of solidification and drying. When using it, we need to dip the surface of the pigment with a dip pin and dissolve the pigment. Google Translate has really opened up the world of watercolor art supplies to me, because there's a lot of countries that manufacture watercolors that otherwise I would not have any idea about their products. But I feel like Google Translate and I today did not quite see eye to eye. Hopefully you guys got something out of it, because it was kind of a headache. Since today is a double feature and I don't want this to take longer than an hour for you guys, I'm going to be doing a lot of today's review in time lapse with voiceover. So normally I like to kind of do a mix where you guys get my immediate in the moment reaction as I'm experiencing it, with time lapse for more relevant information. But this could, my reviews have been going on for like an hour lately, and this could take 2. So for your sake and mine, we're gonna do most of this in time lapse. But I am gonna check back in with you guys at the end. We're gonna talk about the findings. We're gonna compare the 2 palettes side by side. And we might even bring out some other watercolor palettes that I reviewed recently as part of my student grade showdown, and talk about how these rank compared to those, and would I even recommend you get either of these 2 palettes. So when I'm reviewing watercolors, even inexpensive watercolors like this, it is through the lens of a watercolor illustrator and comic artist. So I think I bring something a little bit special to the table. I probably have a lot in common with people who color for relaxation, but my needs do differ in that it is my own art and illustration that I'm coloring, and I am using color to convey a story that I'm telling over on 7inchcara.com. So I like to disclose that early on, because you've got people who review watercolors for fine art, and you've got people who review watercolors for coloring for relaxation or for crafts, and those are all totally valid. And reviewing for watercolor comics is also pretty dang valid as well. Lately, I've been reviewing a lot of really inexpensive watercolors because people are always asking me to recommend affordable watercolors to them. So it's nice to, know what's out there, know what people are buying, and be able to recommend stuff that I like and I think will work well for them. So that is my goal with this student grade showdown. This showdown absolutely would not be possible, would not be feasible without the amazing help and support of my fantastic patrons on Patreon. I don't know if you guys know this, but YouTube does not make money, and I am so grateful to my patrons for their support, because that allows me to buy supplies that I review here on the channel. So if you like what I do, if you think I'm doing a great job, you can hit that subscribe button, you can leave me a friendly comment, you can click the like button, or you can join, or you can do both. You can join me over on Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup. So today we're going to be doing swatching on cotton rag watercolor paper. We're going to be using my Blick Studio block. We're also going to be doing color mixing. We're going to try to do atomic mixing, which is where you smash the 2 colors together, as well as optical mixing, which is when you glaze the 2 colors one on top of the other. We're also going to do a lift test to see how prone to lifting these 2 watercolors are. And we're also going to do a wet into wet test to see how well the pigments actually diffuse out into water. Then I'm going to give you guys usually I'd give you my pros and cons. In this instance, I'm going to compare the 2 sets, let you know which one's actually worth your money, if this one is worth the additional $3. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of both sets. I'm going to talk about some other watercolor sets that I've reviewed, and I hope you guys will check those reviews out as well. But I will include a snippet just to kind of let you guys know how these stack up against those. And then finally, we'll have a final verdict as to whether both, either, or neither of these sets is worth your money. This is all part of helping you guys make art a habit. So this cheaper pink set is better than I expected. A few years ago, I reviewed a number of similar style, like dry, chalky little cakes, like from Alex and Artist Loft, and those were terrible watercolors. These had better color activation and aren't quite as chalky as those, but I wouldn't go so far as to call these good watercolors. Now, these are full of optical brighteners. You guys are gonna see when I start swatching, because I'm gonna show you guys the rinse cup. Just getting my swatches all set up to begin with. But these are gonna muddy the water up fast, and that's one of the ways I can tell they're full of optical brighteners. Now, I've talked about optical brighteners a lot on this channel, so I'm not gonna go too much into them. I will say that in general, they're not bad or good, they're cheap. It's like saying chicken nuggets are bad or good. You know what you're getting when you buy McDonald's chicken nuggets. No one's pretending they're eating health food when they're eating chicken nuggets. But too many extenders is bad because the paints are gonna just perform really poorly. A little bit of optical brighteners is fine because they can make the paints more appealing on the paper and on the half pan. So it's kind of a your mileage may vary situation, but with these, I would say they are full of optical brighteners. So you're not really getting a lot of pigment, you're mostly getting a lot of extender. And they do muddy and dirty your water fast. So if you are gonna use these watercolors, I really recommend you clean out your rinse cup multiple times per session. So I'm giving these the best shot possible. I'm spritzing them with some clean water, and I'm also going to be swatching them on a cotton rag paper. Believe me, these watercolors really don't merit a cotton rag paper, but I want it to be as fair and objective as possible, and I use the Blick Studio watercolor for all of my watercolor reviews, so why stop now? On the second row, I accidentally swatched the same red twice, and I apologize. They really look similar, so it's easy to kind of lose your place, especially if you're like listening to a podcast while you're swatching watercolors. And because the top of this palette is hinged, this thing has a really big desktop footprint when open, larger than a standard palette and larger than that Schpirerr palette I reviewed not so long ago. Now, all of these colors leave a lot of chalkiness. There's a bit of opacity to all of them, but there isn't really much oomph even in mass tone. I kind of like these, but it's really only because they exceeded my expectations, because I figured they were going to be absolutely terrible, but they're probably on par with the Xiley W watercolors. And you guys saw from me showing you guys my swatch cup, if it looks bright red in the swatch cup, that's not the best sign. So these are probably not as good as most of the other student grade watercolors that I'm going to review as part of this showdown. So if you're on the market to buy inexpensive but good watercolors, not this set, please. And for some reason, I really want to do a modified field test with these because I want to see if I know enough tricks to get something half decent out of them. And because I think these are similar to what a lot of young artists are going to be painting with. And I'd like to be able to figure out ways to help them paint what they can imagine. So unlike with the pink set, I actually have color names for the blue set. So I don't have pigment info, but I've got names. We've got light yellow, light orange, light cadmium red, carmine, deep red, light pink, pink purple, lake blue, general blue, light purple, lemon yellow, medium yellow, orange yellow, orange red, cadmium red, alizarin crimson, rose red, fuchsia, deep ultramarine, deep violet, cobalt blue, cobalt purple, deep purple, permanent pilot, permanent blue, light green, grass green, ochre, cook brown, gray brown, raw ochre, dark gray, charred ochre, dark cobalt blue, sky blue, light blue, malachite green, emerald green, light green, earth red, deep ochre, dark brown, light brown, and black. And that comes from their Amazon listing. So again, I'm going to give them a spritz with water. This allows the half pans to soak up some of that water, and it makes the paint more readily available so we don't have to really scrub at these half pans to get any of the pigment. I'm going to let it soak in for a while. You guys can see we're already getting some milkiness. So the areas where the water hit are a little bit lighter than the areas where it didn't hit. That's another sign that you're dealing with optical brighteners here. But I think this set is going to have not nearly as many extenders as the pink set. So these are definitely more saturated than the pink set by far, but I would bet they're using the same pigments, just in a different formulation. These are also still full of optical brighteners. They really glop up on the brush, and you can see from the rinse water, and I'll show you guys that in a second, that there's a lot of white in here. The colors are a lot more saturated, but they're probably not as saturated as, say, the Mei Liang or the Schpirerr palettes that I reviewed not super long ago. Of course, this palette is half the price of either of those palettes, so I'm not surprised that it doesn't handle as well. Already, I think I like these more than the pink set, but I feel like this also has some of the same sort of issue that I saw with the Cool Bank set, just not as difficult to activate as the Semi Art set, and hopefully it handles color mixing better than the Xiley W and the Semi Art set. And don't worry, at the end of our Unbox and Swatch, I'm going to actually pull out all those sets I just talked about and compare them for you guys. But you should also be able to find the full reviews for those watercolors if you're curious about them. I hope you will check them out in my student grade Showdown playlist, and I'll have that down in the description as well as in the cards. But you guys can see we're not really getting a lot of granulation. We're not really getting a whole lot of saturation either, especially compared to some of the other student grade paints that we've reviewed. We're not really getting what I would call visual interest, and that's kind of what makes them feel similar to the Cool Bank watercolors. Since there's no mixing area on this palette, I'm going to use my Teflon sheets for mixing, and I'm starting by laying down my optical mixing grid, and that'll give it a chance to dry while we do our atomic mixing. And I had a hard time finding the primaries in this set, partially because the colors themselves are so bright. So surprisingly, these seem to... Sorry. These are really milky and chalky. So these are kind of strange because it seems like I can mix colors, but everything except for the oranges and purples seem really desaturated. But I can actually mix purples and Payne's Gray, which is an improvement over the Xiley W palette. There's a little bit of granulation, at least while the colors are still wet. Now, I feel like this set has more duplicate or similar colors, especially among the 4 pinks, the 2 ultramarine blues, and the several cool blues. There's also a lot of oranges in this set, which I find kind of strange, as orange is such an easy color to mix. So you guys can see the purples are actually not half bad, and generally purple is one of the colors that, even though I know how to mix it, and some palettes mix it successfully, some palettes really struggle with it. So it's one of those indicator colors that lets you know whether a palette is good or not. I was kind of surprised that I was able to mix purples with this set. So for our optical mixing, I was kind of surprised that these seem to layer decently well without a lot of reactivation or color movement. And while wet, the colors are still fairly transparent, so those are good signs. So I'm doing the same thing with the blue set where I'm setting down my glazing mix first to give it a chance to dry. There is a mixing palette for this set, so I am going to utilize that in today's review. And it's more challenging to mix purples with the set, and you guys will see that in a minute. And it's even harder to mix a good Payne's Gray because there isn't really a true burnt sienna. There really isn't much granulation at all in these paints, which is pretty disappointing because the color feels flat because it's so finely milled. And these muddy the water really fast, so I need to constantly refresh my water with filtered water so that I can get the cleanest colors possible and be able to best judge this palette. So for our optical mixing, these also seem to take glazing decently well. There is a little reactivation, but not too bad. And I also didn't wait all that long to glaze it, and there's some muddiness to the glaze. So for the lift test for the pink set, I noticed that not all the colors lift the same amount, which is actually good to see because just in general with pigments, not all pigments are going to have the same lifting properties. So it's good to see that everything isn't super uniform. It also kind of tells me that whatever they're using at the binder here isn't necessarily overriding the natural properties of some of these pigments. Unfortunately, the blue set didn't do as well as the pink set because all the colors are fairly lifting, although some lift leaving a slightly different color or stain, and they seem to be more lifting than the pink set. So one of the colors that I noticed this in particular is the ultramarine blue. So normally with ultramarine blue, because it's a more granulating color, you're going to have more lifting. It's not going to be as prone to staining. With this color, a lot of the blue lifted, as you guys will see in a second, leaving some of the purple more noticeable, which I just found a little bit strange. For the wet into wet test, I'm still working with a full cotton rag paper. I go ahead and I saturate it fully with clean water. And while wet, the color in the pink set is really light and unimpressive. You have to keep going back into it to add more color to get any kind of saturation. But the granulation is really misty and pretty. The colors also dried really light and misty. So to me, this set is really full of extenders. You're gonna need to use a lot more paint if you want to get any kind of saturation with your color. Now, that orange did give us more saturation, but it's kind of the outlier because I think you guys can probably see even working at full saturation. And yes, I know the paints are diffusing into water, but like if you look where they initially go down, there's just not a lot of color to them. And you guys can see with the hyperlapse that these dry a lot lighter. So for an already desaturated watercolor, the fact that they dry so light is very concerning. Now for the same test with the blue palette. I have higher hopes for this palette because it does have more saturation than the pink set. Using the same paper, using a cup of clean purified water, I'm going to saturate our paper and then start diffusing some pigment into it. And wet into wet, these really lose their impact fast, and it takes a lot of paint to try and recapture that. While it's still wet, the pigments do move around quite a bit. Some colors are more impressive, and by that I mean they actually show up, than others. Like ultramarine and some of the reds have more impact than pretty much all of the pinks or the light green that I'm gonna add or the purples. It does seem like there's more granulation when it's wet, but I think the texture of this paper is helping with that a lot. And this one dried somewhat more desaturated, although not as much as with the pink set. Since I'm reviewing two sets today, I wanted to give a little mini verdict halfway through each, just so that you guys know my thoughts about that specific palette. So for this cheaper pink palette, it really performed better than I expected, but that's really not saying much because I had really low expectations for this set. It's probably about on par in terms of quality with that Xiley W palette. We'll talk about that a little bit later on, with different issues. I can't really see this set handling anything like you might want from more professional watercolors, but I am feeling up to field testing these and finding out for myself. So can I recommend these? No. With the blue set of the Giorgione watercolors, I felt like the colors were a little bit flat. I personally really enjoy some granulation to my watercolors. I feel like it just adds a lot to it. Not all of them should or will granulate, but there's certain colors that should be granulating, like ultramarine blue should be granulating, and the ultramarine blue here is really something. It doesn't granulate, and there's a lot of like not just purple but like fuchsia undertones to it. So watercolors that don't granulate don't really appeal to me in general because they feel flat. If you've been a fan of the channel for a long time, a few years ago I reviewed Turner watercolors. That was one of my complaints about the Turner watercolors, and it's one of my complaints about Inktense, and just typically really finely milled watercolors just don't really do it for me. Now, I do really like the Shinhan watercolors, and those are very finely milled, so it's not an absolute. So with our swatches though, we really don't see much granulation, but with the wet into wet test, we can see a little bit more, but still not as much as I would have liked. So these are gonna get used up fast because they really glob up on your brush and you end up rinsing a lot of the paint away. And it also takes a lot of paint to get the kind of color you might want, as you guys probably noticed with the wet into wet test. They do diffuse nicely wet into wet, and they're definitely an improvement over the pink set. And I would definitely say they are $4 worth of improvement over the pink set without having reviewed any of the other stuff that came with it yet. So can I recommend these? For their price point, they do perform better than the other watercolor currently in that sub $20 bracket, which would be the Xiley W. But for a bit more, I would honestly say about twice as much, you can get way better quality and it's still really affordable. So I've started to notice this as I review the really, really cheap ones. It's hard to say no because they are so cheap, but does that price actually justify the problems you're going to have with it? I think that's a question that only an individual artist can really answer for themselves. Giorgione versus Giorgione. $10.99 versus $14.99. Which set is worth your money? So these sets actually have a lot in common. I'm going to focus on what they have in common first, and then we'll kind of talk about the differences. So both of these come in a fairly sturdy metal tin. Both of them come with a pack-in, an included pack of watercolor paper. Both of these packs are a cellulose paper. I've not tried either of them yet. This is definitely a very thin cellulose paper. I'll go ahead and let you know that. These are both 48 color sets. Both sets come with a pencil. Both pencils are 2B pencils. It would not surprise me if they're technically the same pencil. Both sets come with a more traditional synthetic watercolor brush. Let me see if I can get this out. The one in the $14.99 set is a little bit smaller than the one in the $10.99 set. They both look pretty crummy. They both feel very light. So it wouldn't really surprise me if, I mean, this one has a better ferrule in terms of crimping than this one here. I don't love the gold tone, but that's a matter of personal preference. Both come with a small scrubber brush. Both of them come with a water brush. It would not surprise me if the water brushes are the same water brush. They do appear to be the same water brush. This set comes with a little tube of white watercolor in the ointment style tube, which is not really, oh, it's a plastic tube too. It's not really, I think, a very good thing. I don't know why they even included this. I mean, I use white gouache to add highlights to my work, but I don't know. This seems like a strange inclusion because these are so light. So these are like chiclet style cake watercolors, very dry, do have a tendency to be chalky. These are half pan style watercolors. Both of them are in inexpensive plastic liners. These are in traditional half pans though. So, you know, if you did get the set and you used up all these paints, you could refill these. Wouldn't even waste my time with this. This is a more traditional watercolor palette style. It's just missing the metal tray. Let me pull this out so you guys can see. You do get additional mixing surfaces on the bottom and you get mixing surfaces on the top. It does seem like the tray is designed to be removed because there's little finger holds here. This does not appear to be the case with the $10.99 set. On the back of the $14.99 set, you do have a finger loop. Both sets have Giorgione screened on them. On the back of this one, it even has it imprinted, which, come on, Etcher, get your act together. Even Giorgione can do this. This is a much larger footprint, even though you're not getting as, well, you get more in this set, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but this takes up a much larger space on your desk without necessarily coming with any designed mixing surfaces on the set. I mean, technically you could, if you really wanted to, mix on the metal part, but it hasn't been coated, so you may see some rust issues. So let's talk now about how the paints actually handle. So when I do these kit reviews, my main focus is on the paints themselves because that's really what we're buying these for. So I noticed that the less expensive pink set, the $10.99 set, let's actually do a side-by-side comparison of the colors. So this is the pink set. This is the blue set. I think they have similar colors in them. They're probably using the same pigments, just with different binders and extenders. I would say the pink set has a lot more extenders. I think you guys would probably agree after today's test. These colors are not nearly as saturated and vibrant as the blue set, and it's only like a $3 difference. So I can't imagine being like, oh, that $3, I'm just not gonna spend it in this kind of an instance, because they're both so cheap. You guys can really see we're able to get much more saturated colors, much more saturated mixes than we are with the less expensive, cheaper set. But I have to admit, I kind of had fun with the weird pink set. I think because my expectations were so low that they kind of exceeded my expectations. Whereas with the blue set, my expectations were a little bit higher because it's kind of similar to the Cool Bank and the Schpirerr Farben set. And I would say it's probably about on par with the Schpirerr Farben set. Maybe not the Schpirerr Farben, I'm sorry, the Cool Bank set. Maybe not as good as the Schpirerr Farben set. So here are the wet into wet tests for the blue palette over here and the pink palette over here. Gotta get thumbnails, y'all. I think it's pretty apparent that this one has better color saturation. But both of them took a lot of paint to get any color at all, really. I'm surprised that the pink set isn't more chalky. I would say for $10.99, it punched above its grade. I would say it performed better than what I would compare this set to, which would be the Banyo watercolors I reviewed a while back. And I really do stay away from cake style watercolors usually because like the Artist Loft watercolors are just so terrible. I would say, without having done any field tests yet, I think the Giorgione pink set, the $10.99 set, is better than the Artist Loft set, and you get the same number of colors. So if I had to recommend a set between these two, I'm going to say go with the slightly more expensive blue set. So we talked about what these two sets have in common. I'm also going to show you guys what you get with the blue set, and also color information, not pigment information, but color information is available for the blue set. I'm assuming the pink set minus the neons, because it does have some neons in this set. I'm assuming a lot of it is the same for both of them minus the neons. There weren't really any neons in the blue set. So in the blue set, you get a microfiber tech cleaning cloth. I don't know why these watercolor brands include cleaning cloths like Paul Rubens and Etcher do, and I just don't get it. Like, do people sit around polishing their palettes or something? I don't know. But I'm going to use that to clean my phone, so it all works out. You also get what I am familiar with as a tech glove. This is probably meant to prevent smearing. Let's go ahead and open it. We didn't open it the first time. I will hold on to this because I do actually do a fair amount of digital art. So it is a synthetic fiber. It's meant to cover the back two fingers so you don't drag it. It's actually a little small on my hand, which is kind of amazing because I have like baby hands, but that works. So I'm going to hold on to this and use it with my tablet. I don't know why they included this. Yeah, I mean, that's the first time I've ever seen that. And then they include a small pleather placemat, which again, I don't really know what purpose this serves. I mean, this side is kind of like a chamois or a chamois, so maybe this is the cleaning cloth. I don't really know. I don't know. So most of their pack-ins don't make or break this palette for me. I don't think this palette is any better or worse because of these additional inclusions, but I do think that the quality of the paints and the way they're presented in terms of half pans is much higher quality than with the less expensive set. So I have not tested out the paper for either of these sets. I'm going to do that in time lapse really quickly. I'm also going to demonstrate some of the other pack-ins from this set. Now, since the brush and the water brush and the sponge are identical in these two sets, well, I would say the differences between the brushes and these two sets is really surface level. I'm just going to use the materials from one set, the water brush, the sponge from one set rather than doing both. But I think the papers in both sets might be different and the pencils might be different. So I will, actually check out those as well. So let's go ahead and do that. So while testing out the very thin included cellulose papers, I'm also going to use this as an opportunity to test out the included water brush. Of course, we've got to spritz these down, give them a chance to reactivate. That way we're not just like scrubbing at them the way we had to do with the Simi Art watercolor. So give it a little spritz, and that gives it a chance to kind of soak up some of the water. I do like the resealable paper packet that the paper itself comes in. I'm going to tape it down just to prevent it from buckling and kipping all over the place. This makes the surface a little bit easier to work with. Now, I've mentioned in a lot of my watercolor reviews that I'm not the biggest fan of water brushes, but that's a personal preference on my part. So it's not necessarily that water brushes are bad. I just don't really care for them. I'm also going to test out the sponge here. The water brush is really leaky and the paper is like painting on cardstock. The water brush is more serviceable than the paper, so I would recommend getting a pad or a sketchbook of Canson XL watercolor paper. It's very cheap and I really like it once you can afford it. The paper might be fun for marker though. I love using alcohol markers on textured papers, and this paper is like a 90-pound watercolor paper, if that. On this paper, the colors are really chalky. The sponge does work to clean the water brush, but it gets soggy fast. So the paper that came with the blue set is much smaller. It's like a 4x6 almost postcard size, and it comes with two finishes, a fine and a coarse. I had a really hard time telling the difference between the two, but when I found an example of each, I went ahead and marked it. I didn't really see much noticeable difference. It is a little bit thicker than the paper that came with the pink set, so it's not really like cardstock. It's much more like an actual watercolor paper, and I went ahead and taped it down as well. And now I'm going to give these a spritz, give them a chance to soak up that watery goodness and release their pigments into the world. So for this test, I'm going to focus on using the included synthetic brush. It's very similar to the brush in the pink set, so I'm not going to review both of them. And I noticed that these paints kind of glob up on the synthetic brush, and water control is really difficult because this nylon brush is very stiff and it doesn't really hold the water, so it's super drippy. It's also tiny, so every brush stroke I make starts looking very scrubby. It's harder to fill a larger area with this brush because it's so tiny. So tiny brushes like this, especially stiff ones, can lead to muddy painting because everything's scrubby and kind of patchy, and to fill an area you have to go in multiple times, which can disturb the pigments that you've already put down. I'd recommend saving this brush for small details like eyelashes and adding gouache, etc. So I switched over to the water brush just to be a little bit more fair. I like both the papers included with the blue palette much more than the papers in the pink palette. The texture is much better and better suited for actual watercolor. And you can really tell how full of optical brighteners these paints are with the water brush because cleaning it is a big challenge. We've tried out some of the accessories in both of these kits. You guys might notice I'm kind of avoiding the pencils. I'm sorry, I will continue to do so. But I would say that the blue palette, the $14.99 Giorgione palette, is worth the price hike and a far better palette than the pink $10.99 Giorgione palette. Most of the useful pack-ins are comparable between the two, like the brushes and the water brushes and the sponges. I mean, for me, all of those are kind of a skip, but the paper in the blue palette is much nicer and it could actually be used for watercolor sketches and postcards, whereas the paper in the pink palette is just really thin, like embossed cardstock. They're not even comparable, I would say. So we've compared these two. Now let's compare these against some of the other watercolor palettes I reviewed on the channel not too long ago. And for full reviews, you guys can check the description as well as the cards. I'll have them all linked for you so they're handy. That's a whole lot of watercolor, isn't it? I want to point out that big comparative reviews like this are only possible thanks to the generosity and the support of my patrons on Patreon. I use the funds raised from Patreon to purchase supplies and consumables to review for you guys. So if you enjoyed this review, if you found it helpful, useful, and informative, and you're able, it would really mean a lot to me if you would join me over on Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup. So this isn't totally inclusive of everything I've reviewed in my student grade showdown, but it's some of the most comparable watercolors to what we took a look at today. So we have the Cool Bank watercolor set. This is one of the first in this current iteration of my student grade showdown. This is part of a much larger kit that also comes with, I think, 6 water brushes. It comes with 2 sponges. It comes with a mixing palette. It comes with a pad of paper. But for the purposes of today, I'm really just going to be focusing on the paints themselves, because in the end, that's what you're going to be using the longest, I think. This is a 72 color set. And one of the things I actually really like about the Cool Bank set is that you don't get a lot of repeat colors. And I feel like the Cool Bank set is really similar to the half pan Giorgione set, just in terms of how the colors perform on our cotton rag paper. So you guys can see there's not really a lot of granulation in either set, but I do think the Giorgione palette has more oomph, it has more saturation than the Cool Bank palette. The Cool Bank palette, it just seems a little desaturated for most of the colors, whereas with the Giorgione palette, you do get a bit more saturation. So out of those two, I would say the Giorgione palette is a better deal for your money. So the Cool Bank palette, well, the Cool Bank kit is around $21.99 on Amazon with all of those pack-ins, whereas the Giorgione kit is $14.99. So if you don't mind sacrificing some of these colors, and as you guys can see, not all of these 72 colors are so great, I would say the Giorgione palette is a much better deal for your money. Also comparable to both the cheaper Giorgione palette and the more expensive Giorgione palette is the 90 piece See Me art set. Now this one also comes with some shimmers and some neons. If you guys watched that review, you guys will know I wasn't really that impressed with that. But it also comes in a fairly sturdy metal palette. If you guys hear me tossing things, well, that's me tossing things to make room here on the table. The pans themselves are smaller than standard size half pans. Inside the metal palette, there is also an inexpensive plastic liner, and it comes with a really small water brush. The colors inside, again, just not really that impressive. Not a whole lot of oomph, not a whole lot of saturation, and not really any granulation either. So I think, again, the Giorgione palette probably beats the See Me art palette, at least in my opinion. You don't get as many additional things. It's not a kit. It doesn't come with pencils. It doesn't come with paper. That's not really make or break for me one way or the other, because usually I don't really like the pack-ins that they include, and I really want to focus mainly on the paints. But I think this palette is around $30, but you guys can check the show notes. I'll have the prices for everything for you guys, but I would say the $14.99 Giorgione palette is going to make you guys happier. It's going to last you longer in the long run. So then we have the Schpirerr Farben Premium. So here are the swatches for that. I was really pleasantly surprised by this palette. This palette in the field test really just impressed me in a way that the Mia palette failed to do so. So I would say I think it's 36 colors and, oh, I'm sorry, 48, never mind. I was thinking it was a 36 palette. So it makes it even more comparable. But you guys can hopefully see we're getting a lot more color saturation with the Schpirerr Farben palette than we really got with the Giorgione palette. And there's a lot that I actually like about this palette. It's definitely a student grade palette. It's not like the Mei Ling palette where it really performs like a much more expensive palette. But it comes in a reusable plastic palette. This is kind of the kind designed for field sketching where you can put your, and it does come with a pad of paper, but the paper is terrible. It does have a back plastic ring. If you did want to take it out in the field, I think it's a little unwieldy for that. But you know, when it comes to in the field painting, I prefer to stick to like 6 color palettes really, or some of those unusual Schpirerr palettes. I really think the layout of this is interesting. It has a cartridge system, and then inside the cartridges, so it's like a 6 color cartridge. Inside the cartridges are non-standard size half pans. So unfortunately you can't reutilize this palette with the half pans of your choice, but you can refill it with your favorite tube watercolors. It does come with some white gouache that I didn't even test. It also comes with a scrubbing sponge and 2 unusual, these are a little bit different, these are a little higher quality in fact, water brushes with the kind of push action to get it to, you know, give you some more water. So if you're heavy-handed like me, if you have a bad tendency of over squeezing your water brush and too much water comes out, this could be the solution to that. You can also post this fairly generous sized mixing tray almost wherever you want on the palette, and that's something I'm just such a sucker for. So this is a more expensive palette. It's around $36. I think it's worth the price bump. I think it's better quality. This one is, like I said, $14.99, so it's less than half the price. But I feel like the difference is pretty apparent, you know? This looks nicer than this does. This has a cheap plastic liner. It will eventually fall apart with wear and tear. But in the end, the choice is up to you. I think the price difference is significant enough that I can't just say, oh yeah, this one is way better, go with the Schpirerr Farben. And frankly, if you're thinking about the Schpirerr Farben palette, then you ought to consider the Mia and the Superior palettes as well, because they're kind of in that price range as well. And I'll link those reviews for you guys. So that's everything I find kind of comparable to the more expensive Giorgione palette. The less expensive Giorgione palette kind of falls in there with Artist Loft and like really cheap non-Crayola children's watercolors, and it's just kind of a dry cake set. I wasn't super impressed by it, but I would say it's fairly comparable to the Xiley W solid watercolor set that I reviewed, and I think that's a white label of a different brand, although I'm not sure which brand it is. So the Xiley W set comes with a small mixing surface. It's a plastic palette. It has like chiclets of extruded paint. These things are full of optical brighteners. I really, really did not like this palette. It also comes with a water brush and an inexpensive, not labeled watercolor brush, as well as a small sponge. I mean, honestly, this might be part of the Giorgione lineup and just not labeled, because a lot of these companies are cross-pollinating and are white labeling from other companies, but also making their own watercolors, which is just kind of baffling for me, because it makes it, as a reviewer, it makes everything really muddy and hard to track down. So I'm not really sure who makes this. I'm just sure it's not Xiley W. Now, if it were between this palette and the cheaper Giorgione palette, here are the swatches for the Xiley W. I think you guys will see in terms of saturation, the cheaper Giorgione palette actually has better saturation than the Xiley W palette. The Xiley W palette was just really unimpressive, really disappointing, especially since it's a little bit more expensive. It's in the $20 range, and you can get nicer, you know, watercolors for less than that at this point. Like the nicer Giorgione set, the blue Giorgione set, performs a lot better than the Xiley W set. And I would even say the cheaper $10.99 Giorgione set performs better than the Xiley W set. So in this instance, I would say the pink Giorgione set is preferable to the Xiley W set. And I also found, because I found the Xiley W set comparable to the See Me Art set, so I guess that also means I found the cheaper Giorgione set comparable to the Xiley W. Dang it, I don't know why I want to keep saying Xiley W. The cheaper Giorgione set comparable to the See Me Art set with, gee, it's kind of like, you know, who's the worst of the bottom? It's like, well, does it really matter? This set is more expensive. Like it's like more than twice, it's almost 3 times the price of this set here. The color payoff for this set is not, you know, indicative of the price. It's really pretty disappointing for the price. This does look a little more professional than this one. I know a lot of you guys might be watching this thinking about gifts to give to younger artists, and honestly, the looks of it, how it feels, is really important, because if you want to inspire a younger artist, one of the best ways you can do that is to show like, hey, I recognize that you're an artist and you're trying to do cool things, so here's a cool gift that kind of honors that. So there's a difference between receiving Crayola when you're 16 and receiving student grade watercolors when you're 16. You know, they kind of say different things. And if Crayola is the best you can afford, I'm not at all insulting or shaming that. You can do good things with Crayola, but if you can afford better, it says that you believe in them a little bit more. So, gee, if it was between these two, I would say the semi art looks better, looks more like something that I would use on a regular basis, whereas the cheaper Giorgione set to me looks like something sold at Michael's, aimed for very young artists, like 5 to 7-year-olds. So just from looks alone, I would say go with the semi art if you're giving it as a gift. But if you're buying it for yourself and you don't care how it looks, the cheaper Giorgione set doesn't perform that much worse than the semi art set, and it's much cheaper. So you may be happier with this one, but frankly, you could just, for about $15, so half the price of the semi art set, you could get the blue Giorgione set and you'll be much happier, and it looks fairly professional. So I do think this would be the better gift than either of these two, and definitely a better gift than the Xiley W watercolors. Let's talk about the pros and cons for these two Giorgione watercolor sets. We're going to start by talking about the pros for both sets. So the price is not bad for either of them. $10.99, $14.99. It's going to be hard to find half decent watercolors in the US for cheaper than that. And the pack-ins are okay. The brushes are okay. The sponges are okay. The papers are, this one is better than this one, but I appreciate that by including those kinds of pack-ins, you can start painting immediately. What about the cons for both of these sets? They are both really full of optical brighteners, which you're going to use up the paint faster. It's not quite as economical as working with a professional grade. You're going to be kind of limited with what you can do. This set more so than this set. This set doesn't have nearly as many of the problems that the pink set has. And the price being as low as it is, it's more accessible to more people interested in art. And since my goal is to help you guys make art a habit, that's really important to me. You don't have to have the most expensive art supplies, the latest and greatest, to be able to enjoy making art. And I appreciate that you can get started with painting immediately. They come with paper, pencils, brushes, and even if I don't like the quality, I recognize that it makes the gift immediately more usable. What are the pros and cons for the pink set? Well, the pros, the price, not bad at all for $10.99, and the included pack-ins are okay. They're about the same quality minus the paper as the pack-ins for the more expensive blue set. What about the cons? These things are so chalky. You have limited saturation. You're going to be able to do limited layers. They're going to kind of start to fall apart on you as you're painting. So I would recommend it if you like to do a lot of layers in your painting, if you really want to build up your painting. This is obviously not the set for you. I also would have liked a mixing surface, even if they had just painted this white enamel so that you could, mix over here and mix over here. That would have made this a much more useful set. But then again, every feature they add is going to make it a little bit more expensive. Also, this thing takes up a lot of desk space. I mean, look at this footprint. It's like a 10 by 14 sheet of paper, and not everybody has this huge amount of desk space to work with when they're painting. And of course, these things are really pretty chalky. Generally, when I do these unbox and swatch reviews, I avoid reading reviews from other people, but it's gotten increasingly hard to find out information about companies without Google wanting to show me a bunch of reviews first. And the number one complaint for these is how chalky they are. People are really, really disappointed by how chalky they are. Now, to me, $10.99, that's what you're gonna that's what you're gonna get, you know? So I'm not that surprised or disappointed, but if you don't want chalky watercolors, don't get this set. So what about the pros and cons for the blue Giorgione set? Well, first off, this palette just looks so much more professional than the pink palette. And when you're out in the world and you want people to take you seriously, sometimes the looks of the thing goes a long way to people treating you like you're more professional. So that already has it over the pink one. Also, this doesn't take up nearly as much desk space as the pink set has. Now, the blue set has some of the same pack-ins as the pink set, but the paper that comes with this set is available both in a fine grain and in a coarse grain, and it's a thicker paper and it just seems better suited to watercolor. So even though both of these sets come with paper, the blue set's paper is a much better option for watercolor painting. So you're gonna be, I think, happier immediately starting out. But otherwise, the pack-ins are the same. It comes with a 2B pencil. I think they were just painted different colors. It comes with a brush and it comes with a water brush. The pack-ins outside of the paper are kind of cheap, but this set also comes with, this is going to be a challenge to remove because the plastic liner tray is really pretty cheap, but if you remove the plastic liner tray, you have more mixing surfaces with this palette as compared to the pink palette that has like no mixing surfaces. And the price is another big plus for me. This is $14.99. That's still sub 20 for art supplies, especially watercolor supplies for student grade and professional artists. That's a steal, and it's not half bad. It's not as good as some of the palettes I've reviewed, but it's a lot better than others, and it's got much better color saturation than the pink set without as much of the chalkiness, and not every color is just like super opaque. So I think it's not as full of extenders as the pink set is. For our final verdict, I'm going to answer or attempt to answer the burning question, is either set worth it? So while neither set is stellar, for the price, the $14.99 Giorgione 48-piece set punches well above its pay grade. The pink set is far less impressive, but also much cheaper, and it performed better than I expected, especially because I'm kind of comparing it against Alex watercolors and Artist Loft watercolors and other cake-style, very chalky, inexpensive watercolors. I'm gonna have to modify my field test standards a bit for both of these palettes so I can find a way to make them shine, but both performed better than expected. I would say for the price, go ahead and upgrade to the $14.99 set. So this blue set would make a great gift for an artist on a budget, whether it's a card maker, a hand letterer, or someone who wants to paint cartoony portraits. I don't think these paints will take too many layers, so a lighter hand is probably best. I had a lot of fun comparing these two Giorgione watercolor palettes side by side. While the price difference is fairly negligible, we have $10.99 for the pink and $14.99 for the blue. I think the performance of the blue definitely makes it a better purchase, a better investment, and a better gift than the pink set. So if you're going to buy one of these two sets, in my opinion, I think your money is better spent on the blue set. And I think you or whoever you choose to give it to will be much happier longer. So the blue paints are much more saturated, they behave more like regular watercolors, and the included accessories in the blue set are also much nicer. The palette the blue set came in is also more useful, and it includes mixing surfaces, which the pink palette doesn't really include. Which of the two palettes are you more likely to buy? Are you more likely to buy my recommended $14.99 Giorgione watercolor palette, or are you really trying to pinch those pennies, or you're just intrigued and you're gonna end up with the $10.99 Giorgione watercolor palette? If you end up getting either, let me know in the comments what you thought. If you enjoyed them, if you had a different experience with them, let me know. So I happen to have my swatches down here. It's very windy in Southeast Louisiana in the fall. I happen to have my swatches down here with me. So these are for the $14.99 set. These are for the $10.99 set. I think even in the sunlight, the difference is really striking between the two. And I found that in general, the more expensive $14.99 set really did perform a lot better than its cheaper counterpart. So you guys know which one I'm going to be recommending in the future. This is all part of a much larger student grade watercolor showdown. I'm trying to find the best affordable, economical watercolor palettes that will actually paint, so that I can let you guys know all about them. So this is just one segment in a much longer series, and when I finally finish reviewing, I'm sure I won't review all of the ones in existence, but I've got quite a few for you guys. I will let you guys know where they rank, which ones are the best, which ones are the worst, and that's gonna be a long time from now. So if you enjoy these kind of reviews, if you find them helpful, useful, inspiring, or if they have helped you make art a habit, it would really mean a lot to me if you shared this video with your friends, anybody who you think might be interested, or anybody who nerds out about cheap art and stationery supplies. And if you guys would leave me a big ol' thumbs up, and maybe consider supporting my work over on Patreon, because all of these palettes, as cheap as they are individually, do get quite expensive. And speaking of patrons, here are my amazing patrons. Thank you guys so much for your help and support. You guys make this possible.